Hello, this is NorQuest College's podcast with Dr. Jody Abbott and Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Wilson. A podcast covering challenging and difficult issues affecting both students and soldiers alike. From leadership to sensitive subjects to current affairs, the podcast will discuss the issues in an open manner with an eye to identifying and expanding ideas on all sides of the discussion. The presenters may at times express their personal opinion or take a contrary position to expand the conversation and develop a deeper understanding of the issues at hand. So with us today is Dr. Jody Abbott, president of NorQuest College. Jody became the president of NorQuest in 2010, and before that had a proven track record for delivering results in healthcare with the Canadian Diabetes Association, Alberta Health, and Alberta Health Services. Also joining us is Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Wilson, commanding officer of the 20th Field Artillery Regiment, Canadian Army, based in Edmonton and Red Deer. Colonel Wilson brings broad military experience both in the regular force and reserves, with operational tours in Somalia, Bosnia, and multiple tours of Afghanistan. So I'll now invite Jody and Jeff to start the podcast.
Welcome everybody to the podcast, Leadership in Challenging Times, podcast number 8. And today we're going to be talking about inclusive leadership.
And I think inclusive leadership is a great topic, given that the day that we are taping this podcast is National Indigenous Day.
Yeah,
so just a shout out for all Indigenous people across Canada for how you contribute to our society. Today we have a guest with us, Dr. Laurie Campbell. I'll just give you a little background on Laurie. Laurie is the principal at NorQuest College's Colburn Institute for Inclusive Leadership and has a very strong background in education and diversity. Laurie has a PhD in educational administration and leadership and a really interesting career. Laurie has lived in the North as an ESL instructor and also in the area of Fort Smith, so in the far north, which is fantastic. So you bring lots of experience. After returning to Edmonton, Laurie led the inaugural Aboriginal Teacher Education Program at the University of Alberta. Dr. Campbell eventually moved on to Enbridge Pipelines, where she served as a manager of community skills and employment initiatives, and later in the role of manager of diversity and inclusion. Her time at Enbridge saw Dr. Campbell lead the development and implementation of a company-wide strategy for both Canada and the United States. Welcome, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Jody.
So do we call you a doctor? I got 2 doctors in front of me here. I don't know what to do here.
Yeah, 12 years of macaroni and cheese. Call me doctor.
Good for you, Dr. Campbell.
But Laurie's okay. We'll call you Laurie.
Yeah, Laurie's fine.
Very good. Very good.
So I think what we want to do is our topic is inclusive leadership. So one of the things we thought we would start with, just by putting some context in place, is when we talk about inclusion and diversity today, what are we actually talking about? What's the context, and how do we define inclusion and diversity? And I'm going to hand that over to you, Laurie,
Sure.
To give us a sense.
I think that more and more, the idea of diversity is something that's right in front of us. So it's not something that is so hard to define anymore because we're working with it all the time in all of our organizations and institutions. It used to be sort of, is it multicultural diversity? Are we talking about gender diversity? But I think more and more the accepted understanding is that diversity represents all the ways in which we differ, especially visibly, and then the not so visible dimensions of diversity. So that's the way I look at it. It's just the composition now.
So we're not talking about like quota systems or whatever to achieve those goals. What we're talking about is just an understanding that everybody's different and how we bring everybody together. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say diversity is everyone's different. Inclusion is the how we bring everyone together piece.
Yeah. Okay.
So so that's what I would say about inclusion, is that we've recognized the diversity. Now what is it that we can do within our organizations and institutions to make sure that everybody feels they belong, they matter, they contribute, and we maximize their talent?
And in the institute, the leadership program that's designed to help people educate with that. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think it's where you start is with ourselves. We always start as individuals, understanding our own perspectives, our own values, and how we interact, how we lean into difference, what we're able to flex in terms of our values, what's really important for us. So that kind of deep understanding as individuals, and then how we reach out into our populations, into our groups.
It's interesting. NorQuest College is on a journey right now because we believe in inclusion, and we promote it in our classrooms, we promote it in our curriculum, we promote it in the community. And over the last couple of years, we've said, so how are we doing? Because it's great for us to be out there and saying this is important, but you got to be able to walk the talk. And we're in the midst of doing a research study on that, where our office, for example, the president's office, made a decision to participate in this research project. And essentially what Lori has said is, first of all, you have to have your own awareness on where are you at in being an inclusive individual, and how open are you to that. So we actually went through a process of assessment. Each individual in my office went through this process, and then we all got our individual results, and then we got our group results. And it was really, really interesting, because what I found is that I think I'm a very inclusive person, and there were some things pointed out that, well, here's where you are, and here's where you could be, and here's some different ways of thinking about things that could kind of get you there. So why I bring that forward is what you started with is self-awareness. That's really important, and that I think that's been important to me, and certainly other members of our team.
I would say, especially for leadership, that's a leadership competency, in my view. An inclusive leader is someone who has a deep understanding of their own position with respect to diversity, and a real curiosity about what they can do to be more inclusive. They have a lot of courage, because it's hard sometimes. This is not easy work. It unsettles people. You're calling people into account for their behaviors. You're saying sometimes what you are doing isn't inclusive. We need to change. Those are all unsettling kinds of factors. So I think the way that we approach it as leaders is really key. And we have to stand there and say, I understand that this is going to be unsettling and sometimes difficult, and I'm going to lead by modeling that kind of leaning into difference.
Well, and I always throw things back to Mission Command. If you'd listened to our previous podcast, which I'll test on you later if you have, we talk about Mission Command, and one of the baselines of Mission Command is the idea of you build cohesive teams through mutual trust. And that's a really important aspect for any workplace. It's not just the armed forces, it's any workplace. If you don't have mutual trust within your team, you're just not going to be at 100%. You're not going to be able to achieve. If people don't feel comfortable in the workplace, they don't feel like they're part of the team. If whatever you've got set up does not make it inclusive for them, they're not going to be part of the team.
That's right. Yeah, and they won't feel that they can make their best contribution. And as a leader, it just makes sense, right?
Absolutely.
You want to lead teams so they make you their best. That's why you hired them.
Exactly.
To maximize their
true.
potential and talent.
Yep.
So you want to set up the circumstances that they can do that. That's every leader's job.
So in that regard, Lori, if we are hiring people for their best talent, and how does inclusion and diversity come into that in terms of how it benefits an organization?
Well, I think there are several ways, some of which are just practical understandings that leaders already have. If you have an employee that you've hired that feels that they're not belonging to a team or a group, they can't participate, their voice isn't heard, or they're hiding. There's a lot of theory about how people hide certain parts of their identity within organizations because they feel that they're not going to be accepted for what they bring to the table. Those are all elements that speak against letting their full potential flourish. So you really need to, I think, as a leader and as team members. And I want to say also, I think leadership can be from anywhere you stand in the organization. We're not necessarily talking about formal leaders. And I know when I worked at Enbridge, when we started the diversity and inclusion strategy, it was wonderful to see leadership emerge from all aspects of the organization. I think that's true of NorQuest too, Jody. You really see leaders step up, no matter where they are in the organizational hierarchy. They take this on and provide leadership to their teams and their peers. So now I've lost my train of thought, thinking about teams and peers.
Well, no, and the great thing too in the armed forces, we're very much on like, some of it is self-interested too. The population of the country is changing, and if we don't have an armed forces that is inclusive to the diverse members of our country, we're not going to have the numbers we need to have in our armed forces.
That's right.
And so we're very much focused on that, because I can't ignore whole communities, because I feel like I have to look at across the board. And that's one of the great things about the reserves too, because as a reserve officer, we're from the community.
Right.
So if you came and saw my unit, let me rephrase that, my old unit, since I've handed over command the last couple of months. So when you go and look at a reserve unit, what you will see is a cross-cut of the community, because they hired from the community. And so the Armed Forces has a number of really good programs, and we have the Op Honor program we've talked about a bit here too, where we're going through great steps, just as you said. Look at the junior leader and say, you have to stake a claim about the cultural identity of the company.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what we're talking about too, as a leader across the board. Formal leaders and informal leaders have to look at the corporate culture and say, this is what our culture represents. We're an inclusive organization, and we want to have everybody feel comfortable with being part of the corporation. And I really do think that's an important factor, is that corporate culture.
Oh, absolutely. And I love the expression culture eats strategy for lunch.
Yeah.
Because it's so true. If you have that kind of culture and you understand. But the interesting part for me always is, and the questions you get, and they're really good questions from leaders, is how do I know, what evidence do I look for to see that my culture is inclusive? And then after that, if you come in and do work with me, if you do training with me, if you do consulting with me, what evidence am I going to look for that we've moved the bar actually? So that whole area of evaluation and metrics, and being able to have a point of reference from which you go forward, and then being able to look back and say, we've achieved these sorts of, we've achieved these goals. I mean, what does it look like, right? When people feel like they're more included? I think that's a really good question for all of us to think about and to be able to articulate and translate.
Well, what does it look like?
So what does that
What does that look like?
like?
People tend to default, I would say, to demographics. So we have X number of this group. Employment equity operates a bit like that, right?
Yes.
How many do we have of these 4 designated groups, and where are they in the organization? And I think that's a really important snapshot, and does give you a sense of your processes and how you are recruiting to that full workforce that you talked about, right? And then how you are retaining them, which is really important, how you are developing. So that's one set of metrics. But it's the other qualitative set of metrics that I think are more difficult to get at. And this is an area that we're really interested in developing at NorQuest. How do we really work with managers and leaders to say, this is really worth your investment of time and resources, and this is what it's going to look like when you're successful?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can tell you from walking in here when I first started, 3 years ago, coming to visit the college, this is a diverse organization. And you look across the board to every ethnic group, every background you could possibly imagine. I told Jody this, I used to always come an hour before we were doing something here, and I would go have a coffee and just sit downstairs and watch what was happening around. And I found it amazing to see all the different groups of people that were there.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see that diversity at play. Just you have to develop policies if that is what your corporate participants are, if you will, your students. I mean, you have to adapt to that environment when you have such a broad base.
Well, I feel that way for sure, and that's how we started out, right? What does diversity look like? Well, it's here, right?
Yeah, it's here already. Yeah.
So what is it the next, but what do you do with that diversity? It's in front of you. How do you work with it? How do you embrace it as a strength of your organization? And not just, I think saying, wow, we're really diverse. And I think NorQuest is doing a wonderful job of this, especially with the work that's in the workforce development group, talking about, I love the equation of diversity plus engagement equals inclusion, because I think, as you talked about too, when your leaders are working with a very diverse team, for example, or working globally, which is more and more common, that the point at which you're feeling, ooh, I don't really know what's going on here, I'm not sure I've got the full understanding of the context or the diversity at play, and a lot of people just back away, and then you've lost an opportunity, right? I think the NorQuest philosophy is that, again, you lean in, you engage. And even if you're afraid of messing up, which we all are, it's the idea of like, I'm willing to take those chances. I'm willing to have a little bit of, put myself a bit on the line here to find out more about what I need to do here to have a really engaged conversation.
It's interesting, as we were getting ready to open our new Indigenous Center, I grew up with Indigenous friends. I had a sister-in-law who is Indigenous, et cetera, but I felt like, I'm probably inadequate in understanding what the culture is, what some of the practices are, how do I participate in a smudge? What do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And so my first inclination was maybe pull back a bit, don't get as engaged, because I'm really nervous of making that mistake and offending not intentionally, very unintentionally, because I just don't know. And what I've learned, I would say, over the last 2 or 3 years is, first of all, people who know the culture are more than willing to share. And so, I went and talked to Tony, our elder, and Dolores, our elder, and said, sit down with me, presume I know nothing, and start me from the beginning so I know what to do. Because I think it flipped for me. I was afraid to mess up as a leader, particularly a leader of NorQuest College, when we are so diverse. And then I took it as, I'm now curious and I want to know more and more and more. So I think when you step up and you step in a little bit and you say, as you lean into it, the curiosity grows. And I think that that's been beneficial for me and the people that I work with every day, because they understand that there is that curiosity. And I think that opens up all kinds of things.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Because one of the things I wanted to comment on is that, you talked about, take a bit of risk, lean into some of those issues. And, Jody talked about, she's the leader and, concerned about messing up. And I think this is a really important thing for a leader, is that you have to be able to accept some risks from your subordinates if you're going to fully explore this and talk about it. And accepting risk is something that culturally, a lot of times, if you don't have that in your corporate culture, you're not going to accept risk. You're not going to go in there and say, go ahead over these conversations, leave those boundaries. And this goes by something that Jody and I've talked a lot about, is that as a leader, if you're the top of the pyramid, you have to set that cultural understanding of it's okay to accept risk, and balance that risk with a shared understanding of where, you can, and again, mission command again is that you have to use initiative. You have to have your subordinates have their own initiative to address these issues, and you have to accept that risk. So maybe we can talk about how would you approach that? So you're a junior leader. You want to start talking about that and leaning in. We've sort of talked around it, but how do I do that? How do I address those issues? So I've got a diverse group of people that are working for me. I'm the leader. I'm going to lean in now. So I'm a NorQuest College middle manager. What does that mean? What does that actually mean?
Well, I think it means different things depending on what kind of organization you're leading. I can imagine it looks very different in the armed forces in terms of leaning in than it does at NorQuest, and that's a real curiosity of mine. What do organizations, what do you see as evidence of leaning in? How do you model it within your organizational culture?
It's kind of fun. Jody and I've talked about this. I can compel behavior in the armed forces, which is kind of nice. I can tell people to do things and they have to do it. So we actually, a lot of our programs are more directive than sort of talking around the issues. You will handle this issue this way.
Right.
And the other great thing we have about the armed forces is everybody's a soldier.
Yeah.
We take off everything and we can do the same thing at NorQuest. Everybody's a student, so everybody is the same. And I really like that. I think that makes our life a little bit easier in the armed forces about a lot of these issues, because I can say, hey, everybody's a soldier. We have one standard, and it's for everybody.
Right.
And if we need to bump it a little bit over here or fix it a bit here, then we go through that process culturally as an entire organization, and we're always in that phase. You'll see the Chief of Defense Staff or the Commander of the Army saying, hey, listen, I guarantee today on Twitter today, there's going to be stuff from the Commander of the Army and the Chief of Defense Staff talking about Aboriginal Day, saying, hey, this is what it means. You know, we've got great leaders who've served in combat, who were great, Indigenous members of the armed forces.
Right.
But at the end of the day, we view them as soldiers.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people appreciate that, and I think it's great. But at the same time, we don't tell them, hey, you've got to throw away whatever your background is to be a soldier. No, we embrace it all. It's just one big package, but we all view each other as soldiers.
That's really interesting. You know, I've sure watched some compelling speeches on YouTube from armed forces leaders around the world. The Australian armed forces leader that came out swinging after something bad had happened in the armed forces.
Absolutely.
To talk about who's acceptable in the armed forces, and became kind of a feminist hero. Well, and I thought it was so great.
It's so important. It's so important. You can't. When there is a discipline issue or a challenge like that, you have to stake the ground right away. You just can't let it go for 2 or 3 weeks and let it burn, especially in today's environment with social media and how things can escalate out of control. You got to stake the ground, and everybody goes, oh, okay, that makes sense. And I think most people, and it's a common discussion point that we have, is that most people, the average person, is not going to look at inclusiveness and diversity in a negative light. They're going to look at it in a very positive light. And as an armed forces member, we have to look at it and say, listen, these are soldiers. We got a job to do. We're here to defend Canada. And we can't be sidetracked because one person doesn't like this group or is misbehaving or treating our peers inappropriately.
Right.
We're all a team. So we're really good about it. Plus, we have all kinds of laws that allow us to do things that probably aren't available at NorQuest College. But still, I don't want to drive back and talk about it a bit more. But so if I'm in NorQuest College, so I don't have the ability to compel behavior, and I'm a junior manager, and I'm trying to deal with an issue, what tools do I have here at NorQuest College?
Well, you have tools within, I think, the commitment. First of all, the culture has its inherent tools. As you said, everyone's a soldier. I love the idea that everyone here is a student, including the faculty and the staff. It's a real lifelong learning. It's a lifelong learning venture to learn how to be just a better person in community and to contribute to that community. So it's, I think that's part of it. The tools are here. I always say in organizations, you have the tools, you may not realize them. So part of our work, and I think the approach we want to take, especially at NorQuest, is to say, what are your strengths and what are your assets, and let's build on them. Because as you find out, and I found out at Enbridge, when we started the diversity and inclusion strategy, we were kind of shot out of a cannon when we started it because it had something to do with the Employment Equity Act. That when the announcement came out, as you said, it wasn't as if people were like, inclusion? What are we doing that for? I mean, I'm sure some people thought that way, but really it spoke to the fact that all of us are members of a variety of communities outside of work. We have, as you talked about, Jody, your own family and the Indigenous members of your family. We're members of churches. We're members of reserves. We're members of communities, all of which are really diverse. Mm-hmm. So people are already grappling with this and finding their own way to understanding it as personal, as their personal stories and journeys. So I think one of the wonderful things about working with inclusion in organizations is that you can call on that and say, hey, we're already in this together, right? We just came through the holiday season. Look around your dinner table. Don't tell me you weren't full of, it wasn't full of diversity. So in terms of the tools, I think that's the first tool. And I heard someone say this at the learning day, Jody. Sorry, the
college-wide learning day.
Yeah, my first one, so I can't remember the name of it. But listening to an Indigenous speaker say, you have to inspire before you require, and that really stuck with me because so much. Yeah, it's a really great way to think about it because often we also start out with training. We're just going to do training. We're going to shut down Starbucks and everyone's taking unconscious bias training. Has the kind of first line of defense. But I think I love that phrase because it's so true. We have to inspire people to want to do this in certain ways, and we have to make a good business case for corporate leaders that this is really important to their success. So we do that kind of inspirational work. Then we find out where they think their strengths are, where some of the gaps are, and then move in with our tools. And that could be a variety of things: strategy development, training, that kind of thing, policy development. But the other thing I would say is that there's kind of two parallel areas that you have to think about at the same time. And one is our own behaviors, right? our own personal behaviors, but the other is the organizational policy. And so that would be a great example in the armed forces, right? You have those things in place. And you need to make sure that those policies are really strong around respectful workplace. This is what we won't tolerate. This what happens to you, and it does happen to you. So if someone gets called out, whatever's in the policy, that comes into effect. So you need both, I think. Sometimes we focus too much on the behavior and ignore structural policies and approaches that keep some behavior we don't want in place. Like we end up accidentally or inadvertently rewarding the very behaviors we're trying to get rid of.
Yeah, and that's a great thing. We talked about the second and third order effect of a policy decision. The Starbucks is a great thing. Okay, we're going to do this training and everything else. Does this training. And what's the second and third order effects? I don't think they communicated that particularly well, or what their intent was and what the concern was and everything else. And so it actually became a pretty negative thing. And I think a lot of people probably went in there pretty negative about the day and probably didn't reap the benefits of whatever training they were going to try to accomplish that thing. And I think, again, that goes back to that leadership piece. You know, sometimes this is the art of the obvious. NorQuest College students, they're diverse. You have to be diverse. Your policies have to be diverse. They have to be accepting and inclusionary. Armed Forces is the same way. And I think sometimes we forget the obvious, that that's what we've got to do as leaders, is to make sure that workplace will work.
Yeah, I would also add that oftentimes I think around inclusion, diversity, or sometimes around any topic, when you talk about policy in an organization, it's always negative. Yeah. It's the rules. The policy is seen as this is my rule book and I must follow it. And I would say, if you're a middle manager, if you can flip that frame of reference and say the policy actually is a supportive document when I'm lost and I don't know what to do with a situation. So if we take as NorQuest, one of our key values is to respect one another. And this is something that I bring up every time I do new employee orientation. It's respect for me is not this is my personal opinion, not something that is earned. It is something that should be a basic human quality, that we say that everyone deserves respect. You might not like a person, you might not like some of their behaviors, you might not agree with what they say, but I think there's a way to have those conversations that are respectful, and that includes respecting one another's cultures, their religious beliefs, their practices, etc. So I think from a middle-level manager perspective, if you're dealing with an issue with a student, an employee, a colleague, whatever it is, if you go back to that policy pillar about respect, because it's in fact, one of our values, but we also have a respectful workplace policy. Use that as a tool and a guiding point to go back to, because if you make your decisions, so if you have to intervene on something where there is a conflict between people that might be related to a diversity matter, an inclusion matter, difference of opinion around something that's steeped in those areas, if you go back to that, that's a great guiding point for you. And I would say, as an employee, you can never go wrong there, because what you do is you open up the conversation, and through that conversation you have learnings, you pique curiosity. Conversations can be tough ones, they're not always easy ones, but at least you have that anchor to know. And so in that case, the policy isn't the negative. The policy actually helps to ground you on how to manage something.
I think you hit it right on the head, is that the policy is all written on paper, and you can't, as a leader, just say, hey, there's the binder over there, that's the policies, that's the HR policies, you've been read in. You said it yourself. When you bring people on into the company, into the school, there is a program. They go, well, you sit down and say, this is my expectations. And I think that's really important. So when we deliver what we call op honor, which is basically telling down to the lowest soldier, this is how we expect you to behave. It's not done by a PowerPoint or a video or whatever. It is the leader. So in my case, I went and get it directly to all my leaders, to all my NCOs and all my officers. And then they turned around and gave it to their 10 or 15 soldiers they were in charge of. So the messaging was very, very clear. And then once a year, I did the same thing with everybody across the board. And I think that's really critical, because right off, you set that corporate culture that says, hey, this is how we operate. This is our expectations. You can't say, well, the policy says this. Well, you go, well, I'm telling you, this is the spirit of that policy. You need to operate within the spirit, not the letter of it. And I think a lot of times our policies aren't definitive enough that it captures everything that falls into that area, but it certainly can guide you on some guiding principles of where you're supposed to be at within that policy. So.
And sorry,
Well, I was
go
just
ahead,
going to say,
Lori.
it's such a good point about the positive nature of policy as well, rather than the hammer.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the being able to utilize a policy to do what you need to do in an organization, or to call out a behavior, or to reward a behavior, either way, what you're able to do is you also know, as a middle-level manager or a senior manager or whoever you might be, if you have a lead role in the organization, it's not all up to you. And that's the other thing that I think we get caught in when we talk about leadership in challenging times. Oftentimes, everybody looks up. And we are hierarchical organizations, so whether it's on an inclusion matter or anything, what happens is everybody looks to the leader to fix the problem or address the problem, or advance a matter going forward. And I think we all have accountabilities, no matter what role you play in an organization. And when you tie that to an element, let's say, of culture. So if we talk about that in some cultures, certain voices are quiet. So you could say, as the manager, let's say you have a very diverse work group, and you say as a manager, it's your job to make sure that everyone on your team is heard on whatever the topic is you're talking about. I would say, yes, that's important. And I want to ask the question, how do you do that when that voice is quiet, potentially because of many years of learning in one's own culture and their own perspective? But also, how is it also up to one's colleagues to bring that voice out? Because at the very beginning, Lori, you said, why is this important to companies? It's important so that we use the skills and talents of everyone that is in the organization. And if there's a cultural barrier there, how do we engage everyone in that to get that quiet voice out?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because sometimes we just default to, if we can get everyone, we go around the table and say, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? We've done our job. In terms of including everybody.
And that can even be, that could be worse for that individual.
It would guarantee they wouldn't talk, if they don't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think that, it's just a really good question, and it's something to think about and work with in terms of the organization that you're working with. But I would say this, that in terms of inclusion, I remember reading a paper once. There was they said 3 essential conditions for an inclusive workforce. And one of them was that people have the resources they need to contribute. So that's not always the case of being able to talk at meetings, which is, as we just talked about, not always a guarantee that anyone feels any more included than they did. But that they have access to their leaders, they have the whatever the resources, they have time, they have money, whatever it is they need to maximize their potential. Then the second condition was they can see where they've had impact. So that feeling of self-efficacy and purpose at the job. So how does their contributions, how do they get reflected, for example, in the organization or team's strategic plan or work plan or goals for that, for that quarter, that kind of thing. And then the third condition was that they are not more vulnerable than anybody else by reason of identity. So when the rubber hits the road, sometimes when things get tough within an organization, day to day, if things are going great, this is something you can embrace, and it's a happy thing. Sometimes when organizations have their backs against the wall or are in periods of retraction or something like that, I think that's when vulnerability comes up. And so that third condition is that you are no more vulnerable than the next person because of reasons of identity. So
that one's an interesting around that you're not more vulnerable. So if you go back to someone who their own culture has been that they don't speak up in groups, etc. The risk there is by one going around the table, you're actually making them more vulnerable, and you may not even understand that as a leader. And so you might actually isolate them when you didn't intend to. You might have wanted. You think you're doing the right thing to include them, but you might actually isolate them. So I also look at that as think about the range as a leader that you have to deal with that situation, so you don't inadvertently have that unintended consequence. So it might be that you have one-on-one conversations, or do you learn that person's better in a smaller group? Because if you really want to maximize the talent around the table, you want to hear the voice of everyone.
But isn't this what we're talking about here is some really fundamental leadership stuff. So if I'm a team leader and I got 10 people on my team, and to get the maximum out of it, I need to know my people. And one person might be really good on a one-to-one, just not by culture or anything, just by pure personality. They're just not good in a certain environment. And so it does me no good to put that person in an environment knowing full well they're not good at that. Clearly we have to have team meetings and all that kind of stuff. But I think this is what we're talking about is core leadership competency. Your ability to look at your team members and say, this person, this might be the best method I can get the most out of them, and try to maximize their potential. So if that person is not good on a one to, in a group environment, then you do the one-to-one. And with that also, I think that it's something that's often lost if you're, depending on your leadership style, if your ego puts you, well, you're sort of the pinnacle and you remind everybody you're the pinnacle. What you should be able to do is listen to that person. And sometimes a person might take a lot longer than you would to get to articulate the point. But it goes back to your points, then they get their value when they get to have a one-on-one with the boss to explain it, because you've come down to the floor. Because I think that's also on that core leadership piece. If you call people to your office one-on-one, there's a degree of intimidation and everything when they come to the office. But if you walk down to the floor and say, to that person, hey, listen, I really need to understand your perspective on this. Please explain this to me. They're going to provide you that feedback, and they're going to feel valued because you as a leader, sought them out. And in a lot of cases, it's really important just so that you can understand the members of your team and how they present themselves. So when you first meet that team. So I think that's all part of that mindset,
Absolutely.
which I think is what you drive at a lot, is that this inclusive leadership mindset is don't take one template for all 10 people. You have to have 10 different approaches potentially to maximize your team members.
Exactly. And that is, you're right. That's an essential competency of good leadership, whether we're talking about inclusion and diversity or not.
Yeah. I wonder if we can share a situation where we thought we understood cultural difference, and it kind of got us in a bind. And I'm going to put Jeff, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. You shared with me that you had an experience when you were doing some work in Japan, and it was interesting to me because I wouldn't have thought about this at all. But I think when we share our experiences of something happened and what we did to manage the situation as a leader, we all learn from that.
Yeah, exactly. So I wasn't actually in Japan. I was working for a company, Japanese, very, very big Japanese company. So I used to be in the regular army, and I left for a bit, and I was doing some contracting work in the Middle East. And we were in this company, working with this Japanese company, and we had set up this meeting because I was a project manager for this big project. And we had a number of people from the corporation, very, very high members of the company. There's a degree of formality when you're dealing with a Japanese culture that took me a lot of time to get ahead. But we're in the meeting, and it was quite warm. And one of our employees rolled up his sleeve, and he had a whole bunch of tattoos on. And the Japanese folks got really offended by it and left the room. And I had to go with the guy I work with and sort of say, hey, what's going on? And he said, well, in Japan, people who have lots of tattoos are from organized crime.
Oh.
And so they didn't want to be perceived with that.
Yeah.
So I had to go through a process where we basically say, hey, you need to go and leave. And we made it so they could see that he was leaving. And then they came back into the room. And it struck me as like, I in a million years, I never would have considered that. And the honest truth is, if everybody else rolled up their sleeves, except for probably me, everybody else had some tattoo or something on that. But if I had known that ahead of time, I probably would have approached and forewarned my people that this is a sensitivity that we're not tracking. And we need to, as leaders, to understand that. And that I view that as a bit of a failing on my part, that I didn't get out in front of that for this really formal meeting. But I'd never done a meeting with the Japanese, a big Japanese company before. And then when they came back in, it was as if nothing had happened.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, they just sat down and we just carried on.
Huh.
It was like 15 minutes of uncomfortableness, and they came back in and whoop, that was it. We carried on.
So everyone recovered, eh?
Yep.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting if we use that as an illustration for, as NorQuest does more and more international work,
Right.
as we go to other countries, how do we prepare our employees? Because we're in a very diverse organization, and we live in Canada, in Edmonton. And so I think there's also the context of the country you live in, even though it's a very diverse country. But when you go to another country and you're interacting not in your environment, but in someone else's environment, what homework do you need to do ahead of time? And I always think you're better off to over prepare, as you know, I always over prepare on everything. So I always think I'm better off to over prepare and to not believe, and I know this is a case, I don't know everything about another culture. And so, it maybe is, I've prepared as much as I can. I might still make a mistake. If I make a mistake, apologize and learn. Just wondering, advice as we do more and more international development projects, etc. What do we need to do to develop as an organization?
What have you learned, Jody, over the last few years in this role? You've done more and more international work, right, as the leader of NorQuest?
Yeah. So China, for example, I've had lots of prep before. I've gone to meet with leaders of institutions in China, and I've learned about meeting etiquette in terms of, there's the very formal part of a negotiation, and then there is always a meal. And I find it amazing that no matter where you go in the world, if you center things around food, relationships develop. But even in the process of how you enjoy a meal together, there is a process where you sit around a round table is important, and you're directed on where to sit based on interesting position and influence that you might have in your organization. So I've tried to soak up as much as that, and it's really interesting because my first mission that we went on behalf of NorQuest, there was lots of information, but then when you're not living in it every day, it's like, I better make sure that I'm prepared, because we are all going into these relationships with the best intention, and inadvertently we're going to make a mistake somewhere.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we're lucky in the armed forces, before we deploy, we go on deployment, you do some cultural sensitivity training to get you ready when you're going over there. And a couple of places, one of them was, for one of my tours, was you always had tea before, chai tea. You always had chai tea before a meeting. It was like, don't expect to go in there and go right to the meeting. That's not how it rolls. Give yourself an extra 45 minutes, because you're going to sit down and have tea and talk, and then eventually get down to business. For a lot of people in North America, where it's like, no, meeting starts at 8, we're starting it at 8. We're going to start talking. And you had to understand that was part of the culture. And I think that we can equate that back to some here and in some cases, depending on who your employee is, sit down and having a coffee or tea and talking through some generics and then getting into the formality of the issue might actually be more effective leadership strategy for dealing with that employee if you understand that part of the culture.
Yeah.
And the other one that I learned from being overseas as well is that in a lot of cultures, a lot of stuff is about face. You can't take a person down in front of other people. You cannot be directive with them where they're going to lose face in front of other people. And you have to be very cognizant of that in some negotiations and some dealings, that you literally have to create the environment where you go through a bit of a ceremony, if you will, and then you can get to the issue, but you can't let the person you're talking to lose face.
Right.
And that's a huge deal too for a supervisor. And again, we can equate that back to our inclusive environment, is that if you know that person based on their background and the research and discovery you've done about their culture, is that if you make them lose face in front of their peers and stuff like that, you're not going to proceed with anything constructive.
No, gosh, that should be a value for all of us in any circumstance, right?
Yeah. And it's something you have to look at very carefully, that their approach for that junior manager that you're going to go talk to them about an issue, you can't do it collectively. You're going to have to pull them aside. You should do that anyway if you do informal stuff, but in some cases it's the extreme of even talking to them about a problem in front of their employees is the issue, right? So, So I think that's how we can bring those things back into what we're doing in our everyday.
And I think it goes back to the foundational piece of respect for the organization. I had a conversation with an individual at an international event that I was at, and I was talking about NorQuest and that we fundamentally believe in the value of respect for one another, all cultures, all religious, all gender, the whole piece of diversity. And she asked me a curious question. So what does respect mean in your culture? And what does respect mean in another culture? And I was like, well, what do you mean? Respect is respect. And so when you look at meeting etiquette, our meeting etiquette might be that we come in and it's most important that we're on time, we get the work done, we get out on time, we use people's time well. But you may interact with individuals from another culture that you will have tea ahead of time. You will have a prayer ahead of time. And so even in a concept that in my head was simple and understandable, the concept of respect, it was like, okay, that's something to think about, because it was my bias that says this is how I see what is respectful, where in someone else's world, what I might think might not be what they see as respect at all.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that example of respect. I mean, something like safety, same thing. How do we define safety?
Yes.
And, and it's a huge issue, right, for a lot of organizations and, especially in Alberta, in the industrial sector. And so it's a huge value at Enbridge. But we can't always assume that everybody takes the idea of safety up in the same way. And when you're asked to kind of unpack that, what does safety mean? Does it mean we're all individually accountable, which is kind of the way we think about it? Lots of ways, right? You're responsible for your own safety.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing in other people's understanding of it. It's we're accountable to each other. We're not accountable at all. It's the will of a higher power, like that kind of thing. So I think that those are terms that we have to be careful about. You make me think about just not tossing them around as if they're, like we make meaning together. I think that's a really important point, that together in communities and meetings and so on, we can co-construct meanings around things like respect, safety, and that kind of thing. And those are, again, I think some fundamental competencies that leaders bring to the table and helping us kind of construct that shared knowledge, shared understanding, what we're talking about.
Yeah, because talk about unit safety policy or corporate safety policy. There's the book over there. That's a safety policy. You're not going to have a very good and successful safety policy if you just refer to everybody to the sign on the wall in the manual. You have to live it and understand it. And I think that these are parallels. It's a great parallel because most people can visualize safety and say, okay, hey, that makes sense. We're talking about the same thing with culture as well. This is a fundamental leadership tenet. You've got to know your people and you've got to work through that. And just like safety, I would expect the leaders go and talk to their people about safety, and everybody is responsible for it. And they're a stakeholder in the corporate safety.
Right.
Across the board. So that's a good analogy.
So as we were talking about inclusive leadership today, it's really interesting that I think, have come back to something that we've talked about in every podcast, which is the importance of communication. So what I heard is, great, you can have a policy on inclusion, a policy on safety, but it's as a leader in an organization, whether you're a formal leader or an informal leader, you have to listen, you have to speak and educate, and you have to explore together, because that's how you will move forward the culture that you want in the organization.
Yeah, and be adaptive. Your leadership style has to be adaptive. You just can't have one leadership style.
It's not static.
You have to be adaptive.
Yeah. So, Lori, at the outset, we talked about the Colburn Institute for Inclusive Leadership. As we know, this week we had an announcement of a $1 million gift given by Dr. Ann Colburn. And I wonder if you can just tell us, what is the Inclusive Leadership Center going to do?
Well, we're going to focus, first of all, on leadership and all the wonderful ways we've talked about it this morning. That's going to be the nucleus of the work we do and underpins everything we do, I think. The understanding that, again, it's leadership within the organization from anywhere you stand. And I think that really aligns with Dr. Colburn's understanding of leadership as well through her career. So we want to encourage, nurture the capacity to lead inclusion from anywhere you are in the organization. We'll help you understand where you are in the organization at any point in that journey, just starting out. And one of the areas that we're really keen on being able to develop is saying to organizations, look, this isn't, sometimes it's sort of like I got to do the whole thing or not get near it. How can we approach this? How can we make it really approachable? The whole notion of inclusion. I really love the idea of inclusion excellence as kind of a call to action without over worrying about it. It will help you get there, right? To apprehend the concepts and what it might mean to you and how it will improve your organization. So we want to be able to help organizations understand where they are, what their strengths and assets are, where they need to go with respect to what their organization needs and what their particular business case is, and then look for that leadership possibility within the organization and help nourish that and develop their capacity to really move towards inclusive culture. I think that's the work that we're really keen on doing.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that struck me that you said is that people shouldn't be hypersensitive about the word inclusive, and I think that's the takeaway. Because what's sticking out for me throughout this conversation that this is leadership stuff. This is base leadership stuff. It's an adaptive environment where you as a leader have to adapt, and this is just one of the many tools to help you become a better leader.
Absolutely.
Just like if you were going to go to Toastmasters to learn how to become a better public speaker, and you're going to do it, it's all part of that inventory of being a successful leader. Is you need to become diverse in your skill set. And this is just one of those skills. It's not some bad word like, or as you said, oh, I've attended that class. Boop, I'm good to go now.
Right.
You have to understand the point that you're trying to get across.
Yeah, and we're also really thrilled to be able to work with NorQuest's vision around inclusion and diversity. And one of our, I think, key roles is to make sure that we make the contributions we can to our to NorQuest's development of knowledge, to be thought leaders in this space, to really kind of push some boundaries. What haven't we thought about doing yet that would work for us? So that's the other really important part of the Institute.
That's great.
Can I bring it back? Because I want to understand, if I was an employee here, what do I do? How do I find you? I've got a question. What do I do? Because it sounds like this is a great thing, but how do I take advantage of it?
Well, I think workforce, our workforce team really has taken up this internally with staff. We want to support that and add to that in any way we can. So that's where the first stop would be.
So like policy coordination, is that what we're talking about?
No,
Go
we
ahead,
have a department, workforce development and human resources.
Oh, it's like HR. Okay.
Within that department, we have a service that will help people internally, and then the Colburn Institute for Inclusive Leadership is a more externally facing institute where we will help companies.
I see. Okay.
Yeah,
I totally
public
missed that.
sector
Sorry, I thought this was an internal.
etc.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad I asked that question because
Yeah,
I was
no.
thinking this is an internal activity, but this is an opportunity externally. So if I wanted to come and get training or ask you for advice, I can come to here to do that.
Absolutely.
Oh, well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Well, it's good thing we talked about it.
Yeah, no,
That changes everything.
Yeah, and it's actually great because we have our internal process, and I had talked about earlier that, with Lori mentioned self-awareness, we've gone through that internal piece. That was done by Workforce Development and HR. And then you have the Colburn Institute is the outside facing, and the two are melding really, really tightly because it goes back to the fundamental beliefs of our organization.
Wow. No,
It's
is
a really
fantastic.
neat, neat opportunity.
Is this going to be like classes, or is it like workshops that I could come to? So I'm an external company. And do I come in and do that?
You come to us and we'd say, we'd engage with you. We'd say to you, what do you think you need? Why are you here? What's compelled you to give us a call? Has it been an incident? We've had people call us because they've had a really bad incident.
Oh, okay.
We've had people call us because, hey, what's all this inclusion stuff about? How do I get involved?
Well,
what's the advantage? So there are various reasons that bring you to our door, and then we start with you there and say, okay, let's explore this. Let's look at some assessment instruments.
So it could lead to some internal training for that company, or it could be just some advice or some.
Yes.
Can you look over our HR policies and see if this makes
Yes.
sense and that kind of stuff?
Exactly.
So it's kind of like an initial meeting. We'll figure out what the problem set is. Let's start talking
And the
about the solution,
opportunities.
and the solution set could be a wide range of things.
Yes.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I feel kind of dumb that I didn't realize that.
No, it's all good.
Because this is fantastic stuff. Because if you're an outside agency, this is a tool set that is not readily available. It's not something that you just look up. I'm just going to Google up inclusive training. This is something in Edmonton that people could take advantage of within the province as well.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because when I was preparing for today, I was struck by how many people oversimplify. And you can Google and you'll get your list of 5 things to do. And I read the lists of 5 things to do and I thought, wow, this is an important matter. This is where our world is. It's critical we have in-depth conversations and that we support organizations with really good methodology, not just, well, if I do these 5 tips, I'm good.
Yeah, theoretical stuff doesn't necessarily lead to the practical. And I think I tend to look things very practically.
Yeah.
If you're a leader, you're adapting to some problem. As you said, I've had an incident. What can I do? And this is great to know that there is a tool. So to sort of bring us all around, how do I get a hold of you? So I'm an outside company. I decided to listen to this podcast while I went for a jog. Now I want to get hold of you. How do I get hold of the great Lori Campbell, Dr. Lori Campbell?
Dr. Lori Campbell.
Dr. Lori Campbell.
Well, you can email me.
Okay.
At lori.campbell, CAMPBELL, at norquest.ca. You can phone me. And I can't remember my phone number offhand because I knew.
So in the notes here, we'll have your phone number and your email address.
Yeah, those are the 2 best ways to reach me. But I really encourage anyone to call just to chat.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's great. And I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you very much, Dr. Campbell, for joining us today. Jeff, always interesting to put in a few good spots here. A reminder to everyone, you can find the podcast at podcast@norquest.ca, and we are on iTunes and Google Play. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Questions on today's subject can be sent to podcast@norquest.ca. Remember, a conversation is the informal exchange of ideas by spoken word. Don't be afraid to have the conversations on issues that affect us. Dialogue, conversation, and understanding, regardless of your side of the discussion, is a Canadian strength. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope that you will join us again for a future podcast.